Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from the world today. And welcome to another episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. Today, we're exploring a topic that sits right at the intersection of research, practice, and lived experience: how we train communication partners to better support people after stroke. Communication partner training, or CPT, is a widely recognized approach to improving communication outcomes for people with acquired speech and language disorders. But making CPT work in the real world across diverse settings and populations is far from straightforward. It's a classic example of a complex intervention where context and mechanism matter just as much as the content of the training itself. That's why the realist approach is so powerful here, helping us uncover not just whether CPT works, but how, why, for whom, and under what circumstances. In this episode, we'll follow one researcher's journey into the realist space, from experienced clinicians to novice researcher, and hear what it really takes to conduct a realist review in a meaningful, rigorous, and reflective way. And I'm super excited to welcome Yvonne Fitzmaurice with us today, who's going to tell us all about her work and all about CPT and Realist. Yvonne, good morning. How are you?
I'm very well, Alejandro, and thank you for having me. And a very good morning from, I regret, a wet and windy west coast of Ireland. But there's signs of it bright.
That sounds about right, really.
Yeah.
So which again, I guess that it's always, when it's wet and windy, I mean, at least you can stay inside and get some work done. It doesn't feel as bad, to go outside in the sun. So that is brilliant, and I'm super excited to have you here, Yvonne, because I've already seen presentations of your work, and you've spoken about the work that you're doing and the transition that you're in at the moment. So I'm excited to hear more about it in more detail. But just before we go into the topic of today, would you be happy just to share a little bit more about yourself, your background, and your journey in your PhD so far?
Okay, I'd be delighted to, Alejandro, and thank you. You have framed my project very nicely in your introduction. And I am, as you said, an experienced clinician. So I trained many years ago as a speech and language therapist or a pathologist, depending on geographical location that you're in. Um, and I have lots of experience in working clinically over 20 years, and I've really developed an interest in acquired communication disorders, such as you described, communication disorders experienced by people post-stroke. And I have lots of experience in also observing the challenges these people face and their clinicians face when interacting with them in clinical practice. And generally, people with stroke-acquired communication impairment don't do as well as their counterparts or stroke survivors without communication impairments. So I'm on a mission to try and affect that in some way and see if we can enhance the communication skills of our future healthcare professionals. And I'm currently working in an educational setting in the University of Galway and working on the clinical speech and language therapy course. And so I run this communication partner training with students. And the aim of my project really is to extend the reach of communication partner training from just speech and language therapy to other allied health professionals and also nursing and medicine. So what I want to do is really see how I can set this up to optimize the chances of success.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. I think that is lovely. And can I just commend you for the work that you do in making a difference for this population, because it's so important. And as you've mentioned, when people think of stroke more generally, probably they only think around the impact afterwards that they can have, but specifically around the communication. I mean, there's no one day that we're not communicating with each other, right? Either verbally, non-verbally, through all sorts of means. So it is fantastic what you do. So thanks for the work that you do. And what it is and what I hear is that it's quite complex. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of actors, there's a lot of stakeholders. So what drew you to Realist in the first place?
Okay, that's a really good question and one I've pondered on, but I think it's an easy one to answer because actually I think it's the clinician in me and the educator in me. And basically, the moment really I started to learn about the realist approach and realist review, it struck a chord. And I think what really impressed me was the fact that it embraces the messy reality of clinical and educational. And it acknowledges that adaptation and changes occur in real life that are not in keeping with controlled experimental conditions. And also it allows you bring your clinical experience into the review process. So it really acknowledges the clinician's expertise. And as well as that, you talked about, I have PPI advisors on this review as part of the advisory panel. So it also acknowledges the expertise of, these advisors or experts by experience, and also students who are being trained. So I really like that it embraces diverse views and brings all relevant expertise together in program theory development and refinement.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, that all of these different actors, all of these different individuals are helpful to try and test, refine, confirm, refute all of these different ideas and initial hunches that we have. So I think that is fascinating, and one of the parts that I also really enjoy about Realist work. But not only the review process itself, so you're talking about the approach and how it helps other people, but what is it specific about communication partner training, or CPT, as a complex intervention that you felt Realist was the right fit? Because of course the topic itself and stroke care is really vast, and there's so many ways that we can go into it. But what is it specifically about CPT that makes it the right fit for exploring through a Realist lens?
I think, as you said at the outset, Alejandro, it's a complex intervention in its own, the intervention itself. But CPT actually, it's an umbrella term really for a group of interventions. Okay, and I have so much experience implementing or trying to implement or delivering this training, in clinical settings and educational settings. And like everybody, delivering a complex interventions, I've had multiple successes and multiple failures. Okay, so I think that's the starting point. And of course, that opens you up to all these questions. Well, why was it successful? I reflect back on running training and why running the same training to clinicians from similar backgrounds, and how some embraced it, used it really well, others didn't. And even on some wards, it was really embraced. You could see changes as staff changes and went to different wards, even maybe within the same rehabilitation context. Suddenly they stopped using it. So it was always like, why did this happen? How did this happen? How had the context changed? And as you said, I had lots of hunches, but it was really to delve deeper. I mean, how valid were my hunches? I was thinking, okay, so there's contextual changes. Maybe there are different value sets, different resources on different wards. But I really needed, a tool to help me explore it in much greater depth and detail. And as well as that, I've also a lot of experience delivering this training in an educational setting. And I was really struck, but really specific to speech and language therapy. But I was really struck by a colleague of mine who tried to extend it and use the training for some medical students. And the training was very well received. The educators were motivated to use it, but and there were really positive outcomes for the students. However, it was only delivered the once, and it wasn't sustained. And I kind of thinking as well, if I want to extend this training, I really need to figure out, how can it be sustained? How can it actually be embedded into curricula? Why was it just delivered the once when people seemed very enthusiastic about it? And why couldn't it be sustained? So it's all of this, all those questions that, realist inquiry really facilitates delving into. Who does it work for? Under what conditions? Why? And how is it working? And particularly with CPT, I suppose, like any PhD researcher, you explore all the available options, to see how you can progress your PhD project. And I was guided by my clinical experience, by my knowledge of what exists in the literature, and by my supervisors. So questions like, my supervisor was asking me, well, Yvonne, what training are you going to select at the very early stages, and why? What's your rationale? I want to training that can be employed across all. Let me rephrase that. With stroke, you can have multiple communication impairments, language or speech impairments. Currently, the evidence for CPT relates to just one of those. The strongest evidence relates to just one of those language impairments. But I really feel in the real world, if you're working on a stroke unit, you're going to encounter multiple impairments as a result of stroke. So I would like to extend to conduct a training that can address multiple impairments. But we don't know what's effective there. And I suppose the evidence isn't there for that. So also I felt, and in training, we don't really know what the vital or the critical elements of the training should be. So I really felt that, and I suppose that Realist review would allow me or afford me the opportunity to really look at what works, under what conditions, why, in the program theory development.
I think, Yvonne, that is such a lovely, elegant way to explaining the links as well between the practical day-to-day clinical experiences that many have of it doesn't work for everyone, it's different in different places, but sometimes we're left with a bit ambiguous or more questions than answers. Particularly, we don't have the necessary tools to try and shed some light on that problem. So I think that you describe very nicely that process that you've gone through, and also particularly why CPT, being a complex intervention with so many layers. Who's going to deliver it? How is it going to get embedded? How does it get sustained? I'm sure many people can relate from their own interventions as well in stroke and other areas. But one of the other things I'm going to commend you in, Yvonne, is because, as you say, experienced clinician, but you come to Realist as a novice researcher. And it's not probably the most straightforward thing to start, your research journey, because even Realist reviews, they can be iterative and sometimes a little bit back and forth in the process. It's not like, you have a linear cookbook recipe in that sense. What you have is a way of thinking, and every step you have to demonstrate that way of thinking. So within your own experience that you've mentioned, because it all sounds great and lovely and fascinating, but then you got to go and do it, right? So what were some of the key challenges and uncertainties you encountered in your review? And also, not only what they are, but how did you navigate or resolve?
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm smiling to myself as you asked that question because as I said, initially and instinctively, I felt, the Realist approach was right for what I wanted to do. But I left it, and it terrified me, to be quite honest, Alejandro, because anybody I spoke to about it said, "Oh my God, it's really complex and time-consuming." So the perception around how complex it was made me anxious, and then. Really, the big issue for me was no one in my immediate environment, including my PhD supervisors, had any experience or expertise in the area. So that was a real stumbling block at the start. But really, I found I just kept going back to it. And then at one stage, we have this, when we're going through a PhD in the early stages, you go through this, you present at a committee, let's say, and it was a stage when I was still trying to tease out what's best. And one of the advisors on this committee members suggested, well, what about a Realist approach or a Realist review, and suggested I read some of Jeff Wong's work. And when I actually came back, I had already got that folder with what he had suggested I read in there. And I'd read it quite a while back. And to be honest, I'd forgotten a lot of it. But he really gave me the confidence I needed to embrace the approach. So I needed just somebody to say, yes, you're right, go for it. Okay? Now, and I like as you've asked, yes, but what were the stumbling blocks, the uncertainties and the challenges? They were multiple, Alejandro. And I had, I think from the outside, multiple, I would say, crises of confidence as I went through it, and I'm sure that's the same across, any approach you would take in your PhD. But I remember initially presenting to my supervisors, and I have to say they have been, despite not having expertise or experience in this approach, they have really supported my journey of discovery, or our journey of discovery, I'd like to call it. So they've been really supportive. So they've been a really important element along the way. But I do remember presenting, to them on a traditional, let's say, systematic review and a Realist review, and like comparing and contrasting. And I remember we all around this iterative search, and there was a pause and quizzical looks I respect my supervisors have such experience with PhD candidates. And I remember one of my supervisors really looking and saying, surely there have to be some boundaries. This, how do you stop? How do you know when to stop? And I'm sure they were very aware of the time and resource constraints. that are afforded to a PhD candidate. So I still remember that very clearly. And then, of course, I started to read, because things are done very differently. And the reading didn't help that much. While I was learning more, I was realizing, well, they're all different and what's right and what's wrong. And I was listening to your podcast with the PhD candidate, the pharmacist. And she said, there's no right or wrong. And while that should perhaps have consoled me, it's actually quite a terrifying statement as well, because it's like as broad as everything is around this approach. And basically I was looking at people, even developing IPTs, people were using all kinds of different approaches, whether they were doing scoping exercises, looking at existing programs, having, stakeholder groups, expert opinion. That was kind of, initially I just wondered, well, what am I going to do? There were so many decisions to make. And then even, CMOCs. Like I have my program theories I've always presented them as context mechanisms, outcome configurations. But then as I looked, some were going to use IMOCs. There's all kinds of different ways that they can present it. That was confusing. And then it came down to what's mechanism and, reasoning, resource mechanisms. Lots of, I think lots of people would say the jargon, what isn't even, I think, the jargon used and the terminology used, but it's also how to conceptualize accurately what these are. That was a real challenge, I felt. The execution of my review was employing an advisory group. And that just kept me on track, reassured me, helped build my confidence. But I also found, that, and I would say this to encouraging anybody starting out on this, with your own kind of evolving knowledge and expertise, I think, to a certain level of expertise, you become more comfortable and you become more confident. And there are pivotal moments along the review that really boost your confidence. And I feel as you become more comfortable, as your insights evolve, the challenges and the uncertainties, they don't go away, but you manage them better and they maybe wane somewhat. One of my supervisors, I kept saying, it's so complex. She said, "Yvonne, every PhD student, every topic, everything somebody does, it's complex." And she kept telling me I had to own this and become more comfortable and own it. And I didn't really understand till got more entrenched in it that you could own it. And I think what you meant was be happy with it, be proud of it, and recognize that it is helping achieve your aims. So that happened. But the other thing, Alejandro, if I could continue on for the moment, is the advisory panel. Like, I think everybody should spend time, if you're starting a realist review, really thinking about your advisory panel and really thinking who you need to help with regard to your specific topic, your specific aims. So because I had we had no realist experience, I obviously needed methodological advisors. So I have 3 realist advisors and they have helped me so much. For example, one of the things, and I would really advise this as well, first and foremost, I was feeling, I'm starting on this realist review and I want to develop a program theory to guide me in the, delivery or implementation of CPT across clinical healthcare, curricula. So I really wanted to do that, but I felt I'm starting off and I have no map or plan here. I'm really kind of at sea to begin with, and it didn't seem right that I'm embarking on this program theory development, and I felt quite at sea without a plan beginning. But one of my realist advisors, she said, you need to develop a protocol. And she really recommended developing a protocol and trying to get this protocol published. And that really, I started on that and that really grounded me. Okay. Also, I did some training. And one of the trainings I did, you had the opportunity to do an assignment. And I found that was really good because that boosted my confidence and I got excellent feedback on that assignment. So I thought that was really good because even when I published the protocol, the people it was peer reviewed, but the reviewers didn't have any experience in this approach. So I found the training where I did the assignment helped get the feedback from the experts in the approach. My realist advisors also really helped, relevance, richness, and rigor. Okay, the 3 R's. They can be challenging. Okay, and my supervisors really helped me navigate through that. And Sarah Dada's paper, I think published in 2023 about this, really helped. But I developed a bespoke tool for assessing relevance, richness, and rigor. But even my realist advisors helped me use this tool that I had devised myself, and helped me to really be rigorous in how I use that tool. And it really, in terms of the searching and in terms of inclusion of articles and documents, when I used this very well, it reduced the amount of documents and made everything more doable. And the other thing they did, which was really important, I think, from an advisor, and you talked earlier, I think in your introduction, Alejandro, you mentioned, it's not just the complexity of the program, but it's really complexity of the systems it's being integrated into, or I think you referred to that in your introduction. I think they had a better view at the outset of what the finalized and refined program theory should look like. And I think they guided me in where I needed to search, not just, the databases, but one of the things they recommended, I to look at a way more macro level and go and look at legislation, go and look at accreditation programs, go and look at published guidelines. So that really directed me off in another avenue. And I think made the program theory development much more, really strengthened the program theory development. We had a medical educationalist involved as well, and he had such pedagogical expertise, and he was really good at ensuring, that the evolving theory was coherent and plausible, and the visuals and the graphics we were using were accessible to a reader, not overly familiar with what we were doing. So that was really useful. And then last but not least, student advisors and the public and patient advisors. The public and patient advisors, these are people with stroke-acquired communication impairments, and a spouse of one of these people. So I had three altogether. And together with student advisors, they kept me on track. They gave really good feedback and also boosted my confidence. I'll give you an example. And I should say, when you have people with communication impairments, on your advisory panel, you do need to be very flexible, and you do need to develop some skills yourself to ensure that they can understand the complexity and also get their message across. But, at the early stages, I was, when you think of retroduction, when you think of, are you accurately representing mechanisms? Is what you're unearthing, valid? I suppose these were questions I had. And I was sitting in this gentleman and his wife, I was in their kitchen. I went to their house for our groups, and we'd gone through the initial program theories and looking at it, and I was just going over it, make sure everything was understood, make sure we were all on the same page, etc., and about to leave. And his wife just sat back and she said, Yvonne, I'm just amazed. And I went, well, what she said, I'm amazed at how this has captured everything about us, about the two of us and our experiences with CPT. And she said how the outcomes and how it's worked for us. And I think that was one of, the most positive experiences during the PhD, and the most validating experiences and confidence boosting. And I think after that, I really felt this is definitely the right track to be on.
Well, thanks, Yvonne, for all that. Certainly a lot of depth and detail, and particularly very useful advice, I think, for many as they're going through their PhD. Just to summarize some of those challenges that you mentioned, of like knowing when to stop and having those stopping rules, and that there's not right or wrong, like a shopping list, that, it is essentially a way of thinking. And of course, there are quality guidance and also publication guidance into what things they should include, but there's several ways. It can be confusing. Developing initial program theories, i.e. our initial explanations, our initial hunches into why a program or intervention or phenomena may or may not work, and also the development of this CMO configurations. So this causal links between these different components. And you mentioned some solutions like the advisory group, which we'll touch upon a little bit later on, the management of uncertainty, and the mental element of a PhD or any research project really was half the job. Writing a protocol, training, so all sorts of really useful stuff in that little snippet. So thank you so much for sharing all those. And I think now as well, more than ever, there are more interest in realist approaches. It is getting funding, and there is more and more exposure. So I think that for anyone that is looking to enter the realist world, there is going to be a lot of exciting opportunities and a lot of exciting things. But I guess that one of the things that you mentioned there at the end is that, at the end, it's worth it. And at the end, it's fantastic. even though, the process may look a bit like a roller coaster. So, you may go up and down and backwards and forwards and sideways. However, you've basically finalized the review and it's in that process, which is great. So I'm also interested to hear from your own perspective, how has your review and the findings of your review contributed to our understanding of CPT, particularly in the realist terms of how, why, and for whom it works? What are some of the key findings of your review so far?
Okay, I would say it has highlighted, Alejandro, how multifaceted and multi-layered context is. And when planning to deliver CPT as I am, as well as considering the innovation itself, which is complex in its own right, you need to give due consideration to the environment and complex systems it's being implemented into. So that's an overarching finding. Also, when I look back at the examples I gave you, I suppose, and all of my clinical experience has remained at the forefront of my mind throughout the review, considering the hows and the whys, I think it has answered, I'm really happy to say, a lot of those queries. Maybe not all. For example, if we take, for example, the narrow program itself first, it's really increased my understanding about I said initially, talking to my supervisor, what are we going to use? Which program? And it's really helped me understand what to use. And, we've been able through the course of the review to actually describe what the usual components are. Maybe they're not vital components, but what the usual components are, and also how they work, by unearthing the mechanisms, how they work. And also how they work, maybe individually or combined or successively, to bring about the variety of outcomes. So I've tried to depict this both graphically and also narratively. But I think what we've ended up with at the end is an explanation of how it works, who it works for. So, for example, you as an educator wishing to implement CPT, I think you can look at what we've produced and say, okay, I would, what outcomes would I like to achieve for my students? You can start there. And now you can trace back to what resources what resources you need in the context of H to activate the mechanisms that will bring about those outcomes. So you can look at what resources you have and what's achievable and how they will be achieved. Or alternatively, you can look at what outcomes you want to achieve and then decide, okay, I need to put X, Y, and Z in place here to achieve these outcomes. So I think that's very useful for somebody wishing to implement CPT. What it also showed at a much bigger level. So I think I've heard people talk about small C's and big C's before, Alejandro. You may help me with this. But I think there are so many multiple and interacting and layered contexts that have, that have been observable or that I think initially starting out, I would have had theories or hypotheses, but I didn't understand how layered and how multifaceted it all was, really. So what I've explained, and I hope coherently, is like really at kind of the program level, but the program level in the HEI context, let's say. But then what you have to look at beyond that is, and also I suppose, what you have to look at beyond that then is how you can actually go about enticing people to implement it. Or how, for me, how can I extend that reach? And throughout it, a lot of mechanisms, we've discovered quite a few mechanisms. But really, we also have discovered that these mechanisms not, can work successively or interrelatedly, like just triggering or one mechanism isn't enough. So if we look at the example I gave with my colleague implementing or delivering CPT just once, people were motivated. They were attracted by it. They recognized its value. However, it didn't fit into existing curricula and they had no real obligation to continue using it. And I think so it's highlighted the mechanisms that are required. It's highlighted the context which requires these mechanisms. So, for example, our accreditation processes or funding sources might oblige you to consider this intervention, but without, so you need multiple mechanisms I came up, I think, in the end with 16 CMOC constructs, but you need a number of these CMOCs working together to actually achieve your desired outcomes. And who it works for. It works for the students, it can work for educators, and it can work for people with communication impairments. And across these three, there are some mechanisms. For example, motivation is something that all three must have, that traverses all three groups. Obligation is really more prevalent for educators or for the institutions in order for them to, I suppose, take this on board. Does that make sense?
That makes absolute sense, Yvonne. Thank you so much. And I guess that one of the key lines that you mentioned there in the whole process and how it's helped, kind of the contribution towards CPT is to make those results and that work accessible, because there's something that we've mentioned off camera as well about the importance of making this work as accessible as possible. And it appears that what you're trying to do is exactly that, is that everything of all these findings, all these mechanisms and contexts and important implications that you comment in the big C's, in the small C's, that is multi-layered and complex, rather than reducing the complexity, is making it more accessible for people to understand within your real world, how is it that we're going to adapt this. So I think that's a really useful point that you make there.
Yeah, and I think that was a big challenge, Alejandro, to make it accessible. And I think ultimately I settled on the CFR. It is an determinants framework from implementation, and it prioritizes context. And really, I found it was a way to cohesively present the CMOCs, not really from a constructivist perspective, but from a realist perspective. And it just made it more cohesive and maybe more user-friendly. I hope. Time will tell. And also we came up with some pivotal questions to ask as well, which might make it more user-friendly to see, okay, who do you want to train? What outcomes do you want to achieve? And then we delved a little deeper into these questions, using the theory.
I think that sounds amazing. And there's been so much that you've commented, Yvonne, around your process and, going from start to finish in your review and starting, from cold feet to regaining with the realist and now having a review. You must feel so proud after the process and the journey that you've gone through, really, yourself and the team. But one of the things that you have commented a few times now is around the stakeholder group. And I want to just touch a little bit more on that, because it is such a critical element. For example, when you were talking about making the work accessible, the stakeholder group can certainly help, but it goes beyond PPI and beyond just, directing or providing advice. It actually, a lot of the time, can mean that the work and the theories and the explanations become co-produced with the individuals that are sharing their thoughts, or maybe that word that you didn't have and they can give that word. So would you be able to reflect on that process of the stakeholder group, particularly those with lived experience of stroke, in shaping your thinking? So who did you choose and why? And how do you use them, like the mechanics of the advisory group through your process?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And I agree entirely with your sentiments there, Alejandro. So maybe I'll talk about the students and the PPI advisors. The PPI advisors were purposely selected. So I had worked with both the gentlemen. They have experience participating on CPT programs, but also as co-trainers. So they have a lot of contact expertise as well as as well as the lived experience. And one of their wives also agreed to come on board. And then the students we invited they had participated over 2 academic years. They had participated on CPT programs. So we invited them along. We ended up with 4 student advisors. I think you're right. They can help with, how you articulate your theories and keep you on track. And particularly when, you mightn't, like some of the theories that some of our CMOCs or theories, there was lots of data to support them from the extracted articles or, the guidelines, etc. But for some, there was less so. And in realist conversations, you hear about these nuggets that you might, nuggets of information that you might find somewhere, maybe in an introduction or something. So there was, and coupled with our clinical experience and context expertise, we would say these were nuggets and these were really valid nuggets and we'd like to include them. And I found the PPI advisors and the student advisors really helped us determine if it was wise, if we were on the right track here. So if I'm making sense there, am I, Alejandro? So they really helped there. So they really came on board and say, I meant, and I could still ringing my ears. I remember some students say, absolutely, that's exactly what we experienced, and that was, very encouraging that again we were on the right track. And you talk about vocabulary, like one of the students, I was using things like often people experience negative experiences. And one of the students, advised me not to use that word. She said, Yvonne, negative can be a good thing, that when you're actually learning and understanding how to communicate better and having better conversations with people, you learn about their struggles and you learn how communication impairments can negatively impact their existence, how they can lose their autonomy, sense of purpose, how they can have low moods, how they can lose friends because of their inability to communicate. So she said, she advised me to change the word. And so I think I ended up with desired or undesirable outcomes or something, but, and also explained very well what was happening during the process as well. So does that have, and I suppose I'd like to talk about, involving people with communication impairments. I mean, they are really marginalized in research activities. So, and PPI activities. And, it was really necessary to involve these people because they ultimately are the ones who would be benefiting from the program. So like without them, you're really missing an essential ingredient without their input, I would feel you're missing an essential ingredient in program theory development. And really you do need to, you need a flexible approach. One person I met in a cafe every time. The other two I met in their home, and also we met in a cafe another time. So you need to be flexible. You need to have a bit more time and you need to develop your own skills around facilitating better communication. And I suppose if anybody is thinking of this, contact somebody like me, contact somebody experienced who can help you, who can advise you on how best to communicate with people. But I would really caution against excluding, people who are really vital to program theory development. And I know I've noted it here somewhere, but there was, the Realist Hub, there was Sarah Dada and Ferdinand talking about youth. I can't recall what it was now, but it was a video or picture
Photo voice techniques.
Photo voice technique. Or there's lots of other participatory techniques as well that you could use and consider. But no more than what I needed to engage people with expertise in the realist approach, engage if you're considering including people with communication impairments, find people who can help you do that.
That's great, Yvonne. And I also thanks for the offer as well for listeners who may be thinking, because I completely agree with that, about what you're saying, that just because it's, may take more time or maybe more, and there may be things to consider, it doesn't mean that this should be excluded. Actually, the other way around, if you need to ensure that the people that the research is going to serve, that they have a voice and getting that lived experience, and this happens as well with experts by experience, peer researchers, lived experience researchers, to ensure that those voices are heard the best way possible. So that's brilliant, and thanks as well for sharing the impact of the advisory group and how important it is. How often did you meet with them? For those individuals who are thinking about the logistics.
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question. I met with one of the advisors, I think about 3 times. Now, he also advised, as well as advising on program theory development, he also advised on my data extraction template. I think I met with him 3 times, once in the university, and then for about 1.5 hours, 2.5 hours for each meeting. And then the others I met with twice. Now, I met with them as well initially, just in the setup, looking at, how are we going to do this, agreeing that we'd meet separately, all of this. So I met with them twice for about 1.5 to 2 hours each time. And so that, and can I just say, well, one thing that was very interesting for me and kind of across the, people for example, people with communication impairments benefit from some of the benefits are they have positive communication experiences. They increase their confidence. they have positive academic experiences, that they go on to engage in other projects, which, helps them restore a sense of agency and autonomy. And these was part of my program theory. And it actually, we experienced this throughout the course of the research. So, for example, they also helped me. We got some small grant funding, so we co-applied for, and also myself and one of the advisors was invited to present our experiences, at a workshop. So these were hypothesized outcomes in the program theory, and yet in real life, as we went through the review, it was happening. So that was really nice to see, and also I'm now going on to do a feasibility study, and again theorized how, during the process of the program theory, we're theorizing how you should contact people, why people would get involved. And one of the professors of OT has agreed that I can trial this on their students. And as I was leaving, I was thanking her, saying, thank you very much for, agreeing to do this. And she said, well, Yvonne, I wouldn't do this if I didn't believe in the program and didn't think it would benefit my students. So I am much more alert in the real world to picking up on elements of the program theory. Like that was a central element, that belief, motivation, a central one mechanism. And so I think I'm recognizing that this is playing out. So it's positive reinforcement, I think.
It certainly is, absolutely. And yeah, I love hearing about the real world implications that it's having already in that sense, and trying to get into the next stage. And I wish you all the best for that, because I know how
Thank you very much.
the process and the transition that it can be. And maybe at the end of that we can have you again and you can tell us all about it. Yvonne, I've really enjoyed our conversation and all the tips, the thoughts, the struggles as well, and open up and it's like some of the vulnerabilities that many people will really relate with. I'm certain of that. And as you know, every podcast we end with a question, which actually you've already given some fantastic tips throughout the conversation. But to make it really focused, I would just ask for the top 3 tips you would offer others, especially clinicians, new researchers who were going into the realist world, either in the world that you're in and the interventions that you're in specifically, or more generally as well, that are embarking on a realist review. Is there any top 3 tips, the ones that are absolutely most important to embark in a realist review?
Okay, well, I would say at the outset, if you think it's the right fit for you, trust your judgment and really then look for help. Look for the necessary help. If you're embarking on a realist review, spend lots of time considering who your advisors should be. My supervisors really helped me with that. We spent a lot of time, and it was really time well spent. And actually, I meant to say this, but looking at advisors as well, there were 2 papers I would really recommend, if I can. One is Abrams and colleagues, and it's Lost in Reviews, looking for the involvement of stakeholders. I don't think there were many out there, but I found these very useful. And another one is Power and colleagues in 2024, which came slightly after I'd started my, but it's advisory groups in realist reviews, systematically mapping current research and recommendations for practice. So I think they have really helped me. I meant to mention those earlier, Alejandro. So that's kind of 2. I think don't be afraid, trust your judgment and trust that it will get easier. And don't worry if you don't know everything at the outset, or or you have anxieties. These will dissipate, and if they're not, look for help. And I think I would say sometimes I read reviews and they're done, but I don't know how usable the outcomes are, I suppose. And I think this is probably the clinician in me and the need for something practical. Now, I've heard, and I don't know who said this, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. I'm inclined to believe that now. But I do think consider how the end result or your finalized or revised program theory can be tested, is in a format to permit further testing or to permit use. I hope that makes sense.
Number 1, trust your judgment.
Yeah.
Number 2, look for help. Number 3, it will get easier. You will get there eventually through the process of realist.
Yes.
And an extra one for everyone,
Yes.
which is ensuring the accessibility of your theory, some of your results, so they can be used
Yes.
for the audience, like knowing your audience in that sense.
Yeah.
Yvonne, it's been amazing to have you. Thank you so much for sharing all your ideas, your thoughts, your struggles, your tips, your advice, and I know that you're gonna be amazing in the rest of your PhD. So let's have another chat in a couple of years when it's done, and we can see how it goes.
As I said, my second podcast. Alejandro, thank you so much for the opportunity and for ensuring this was a very pleasant experience.
Thanks to you, Yvonne. Thank you so much. And for anyone listening, thank you so much for another episode of the Realist Lens, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, Yvonne.